Good evening. Welcome to Web Lecture 2.1. This is your first web lecture in Unit 2, and we're going to be talking about the Constitution. Now, we've already discussed the preamble a little bit and the idea that it outlines the Constitution, gives you the basic ideas of what our government should be doing. But now I want to take a little sidestep from that and talk about how we got our Constitution and how it became ratified, and then some additions to our Constitution that were added right at the beginning that created a precedent for amending the Constitution in the future. So, let us begin. So in order for the Constitution to become official, we had to ratify the Constitution, which means that all of the states, or majority of the states, 3/4 of the states, had to agree that the Constitution was the government that they actually wanted and was the government that they supported. And so once we had reached those compromises that we talked about before, the compromise of representation through the Great Compromise and the compromise of slavery through the Three-Fifths Compromise, and once the Electoral College was established, we could move on toward ratifying the Constitution, because we had already outlined the three branches of government and things of that nature, so we were able to move forward with ratifying. But there were some issues that made ratification somewhat of a sticking point for some of the leaders in the Constitutional Convention. So we all agreed that the Constitution should protect the individual rights of citizens, so that was not an issue. And they also agreed that we had to write down these rights, and so a Bill of Rights was certainly needed as something that we would want to add to the Constitution. But in doing so, we had two sides that were not really sure how to go about ratifying the Constitution. There were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists were supporting of the Constitution because they supported a strong national government. They saw the problems of the Articles of Confederation and realized that supporting a strong national government was the best way to move forward. They also decided that we needed to limit the rights of the states, because prior to the Articles of Confederation, we didn't really have any cooperation between the states, and even under the Articles of Confederation, states pretty much had their own say as to what they should do and could do, and so that was not necessarily conducive to a strong, united states. And we also wanted to make sure that that central government had powers to regulate trade and to guarantee rights, because regulation of trade was very important so that we could establish partnerships with other countries and make decisions as a whole country, not as individual states. And we wanted to make sure that the central government was the agency that was protecting rights, so that states would not go and create their own rights or limit rights where they might see fit. And finally, the Federalists thought that we needed to create a national currency. Now, that was very important because individual state currencies would not produce an effective economy. And another issue with that is once we had a national currency, that would give us the opportunity to pay back the war debts that we owed other countries, but also our national citizens. Now, the Anti-Federalists were on the other side. They really believed that we should sort of move back toward that Articles of Confederation style government where the states had most of the power, because they were afraid that if we had a central government, it would just become a new monarchy, and that was the last thing that they wanted. And in supporting those strong states' rights, they felt that they needed to keep the federal government from having too much power because literally of the proximity between the federal government and the individuals. Because at the time, there were no telephones or telegraphs or internet, and so it took a considerable amount of time to get from, say, Georgia to Philadelphia, which was where they were holding the Constitutional Convention, or eventually even Washington, D.C., and so they felt that their representatives would not accurately represent them because they would have little face time with those people that were representing them. And finally, a part of the Constitution, which is the Necessary and Proper Clause, which basically gives the federal government the ability to do what they feel they need to do in cases of controversy or in cases where there is a national crisis. they felt that was way too open for interpretation by the federal government, which gave them way too much power. And so the Anti-Federalists were definitely against that as well. And so in order to support their side, the Federalists got together, particularly the Federalists James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, who were all big supporters of the Constitution. They got together and wrote what were called the Federalist Papers. Now, a lot of those were written anonymously so that nobody really knew who was supporting it, but these were created to convince the common person that the Constitution was what needed to be ratified. And so they really sort of made this concerted effort to get out the word that the Constitution was the best thing for the United States. Whereas the Anti-Federalists basically just played response to the Federalist Papers. They didn't have a specifically organized idea that they wanted to support. They were just in opposition to the Constitution, mainly because it created so much central power and created a strong central government that they were afraid of. They wanted to keep the states where most of the power was. Needless to say, they could not come to any kind of agreement unless, of course, we went back to that original idea that the rights of the people would be protected by the federal government and enumerated, or actually numbered, written down, so that the individuals were certain that the federal government and the state governments would not infringe upon their rights. And so a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, which is really the building block for our future amendments that are added to the Constitution, and gives us the idea right from the start that we are able to change the Constitution if we feel it's necessary. And so in ratifying the Constitution, we also add the Bill of Rights. So in 1791, we officially ratified the Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution, and these were set to limit the power of the federal government. And they really put forth a good faith effort by the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that the central government would not gain too much power, and it really was this Bill of Rights that aided in the ratification process, really pushed forward many of the states that were unsure about the Constitution, that this was indeed the document that they needed to support. And so we'll go through the Bill of Rights and talk about the different amendments. And in the Bill of Rights, there are 10 amendments. So we'll talk about the first 10 amendments, particularly the First Amendment, which, if you need a little device to remember the parts of the First Amendment, you can remember RAPPS, R-A-P-P-S, because we have the freedom of religion, which means that there's a separation between church and state, which literally means that the government cannot enforce upon its citizens any one particular religion. We also have the A, which is freedom of assembly, meaning that you can get together and protest. We have the freedom of the press, which means that we have a free and open press not controlled by the government. The freedom of petition, which means that you can write letters to your government criticizing them or questioning them. And finally, the freedom of speech, which means that you can do or say basically whatever you want as long as it does not limit somebody else's freedoms or infringe upon their freedoms. Now, there are two main limits to the First Amendment. The first one is something called libel, which means that you print untrue statements about a person. That is not protected, so you can't lie about somebody. And slander, which is an untrue statement that is spoken. So if you're giving a speech, a public speech of some sort, you cannot tell lies about people. Those are not protected parts of free speech. Now, moving on to the Second and Third Amendment. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. This was created as a result of the American Revolution, because the colonists felt that if our government or any other government were to try to infringe on their rights, then they would have the right to rise up and form militias to take down that government or that tyranny. And so today we still have the ability to have firearms. And then the Third Amendment comes right out of the American Revolution as well. because that says that we have the right to refuse the quartering of soldiers. So if there is a conflict, we do not have to have soldiers stay in our house, which was a direct response to the Quartering Act of the British. So two important amendments that come directly out of the American Revolution. Now, a big chunk of the Bill of Rights is given over to the rights of the accused, people that are accused of crimes. The Fourth Amendment says that there is no unreasonable search or seizure of property. So if you're accused of a crime, they must have a warrant, usually in this case, to search or seize your property. The Fifth Amendment says there's no trial unless there are formal charges brought against you. Also, it talks about the idea of double jeopardy, which means you cannot be accused of the exact same crime more than once, as long as you've been acquitted of that crime. And you may also be familiar with the idea of I plead the fifth, which means that you do not have to testify against yourself in a court of law, and you also have the right to due process of law. The Sixth Amendment says you have to be informed of your charges, and that you have to have a fair and speedy trial, and that you have the right to a defense lawyer. So this mandates the ideas of the due process of law. And the Eighth Amendment says that there is no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. So the cruel and unusual punishment means that they cannot give you the death penalty for stealing a candy bar, and no excessive bail. In order to be released before your court date from jail, they set bail, which is basically a guarantee that you'll return to court. But they can't put that at $1 million if you're being charged with, say, basic robbery. So other protections that are outlined in the Bill of Rights are the Seventh Amendment, which gives you the right to a civil trial if you have a dispute that is more than $20, which means you can sue somebody in a court of law. The Ninth Amendment, which says any rights that are reasonable that are not listed in the Bill of Rights are granted to you. So, for example, the right to travel, the government cannot limit that right. And finally, the 10th Amendment says that powers not specifically given to the federal government are granted to the states. So states can create their own bills of rights to address any issues that were not addressed in the Bill of Rights.